That brings us to the topic of REST API, or you can also call it as RESTful API. What is REST API? It is an application programming interface, which is nothing but an API, which follows the certain principles of REST architectural style. What is REST? The full form of REST is representational state transfer. That is the full form of REST. And what REST API does, as I said, it is a type of API to communicate among programs using certain design principles of REST architectural style. And if we continue with our example, we have the UI application and the backend application. The backend application would be having an API. So the UI application would send a request to the backend application. UI application is the client and backend application is the server. You already know all these. Now, requests from client to server, which are basically the API resources, would be sent in JSON format. And this is one of the design principles of REST architectural style, that the request has to be sent from client to server in JSON format. Similarly, the response from server to client should also be sent in JSON format. And these are the design principles of REST. Of course, there are a few other things. I'm giving a high level overview what REST API is. We do not need to know too much of details around the REST architectural style. What we need to know is that whenever we send request and receive response, the data that we send has to be in JSON format, and data that we receive has to be in JSON format as well. So data from client to server, which is the request, has to be in JSON format. It has to be sent in JSON format, and data from server to client has to be sent in JSON format as well. And this is one of the very basic design principles of REST architectural style. One more thing to note here is that in server, I have mentioned API resources. So APIs are also called resources. And the communication of REST API as usual happens over HTTP using the HTTP methods that we have discussed. In REST, the resources are identified by URLs. For example, HTTP : the IP address of the server or the URL of the server followed by the API. Now I have underlined resources. The reason is that by resource, I mean the APIs. So if the backend server is exposing an API, the way to call that API would be using the URL format. So the request would be sent to this particular endpoint, HTTP : the server IP or the URL of the server followed by the name of the API. If you do not have a server URL, you can use the IP address also. So let's say the IP address of the server is 10.20.10.101 and the program is running in port number 6000. We can send the API request to this particular endpoint also, like HTTP : followed by the IP address : the port name and then the name of the API, which is get price in our case. And this get price word that you see that we send to the server from the client, this is tied to a business or programming logic in the service or the server. So whenever we call this API, certain business or programming logic would be executed, which is tied to this particular endpoint, that is get price or the API. Let's try to understand it a better using animation. So we have this client application, which is nothing but a program. It can be running on EC2 instance. It can be running on Kubernetes pods on EKS or Kubernetes pods on Google Kubernetes Engine or any other application server for that matter. Likewise, we have servers also. Servers are nothing but application programs, which are again might be running on EC2 instances, EKS clusters on AWS or ECS clusters or GKE on GCP. Same is the case with Azure also. It can run anywhere. Now, let's say I'm running a Python program inside of this particular server or Kubernetes pod or virtual machine. What this program is doing, let's say the program is connecting to the database and getting some data or retrieving some data from it. And as it is a program, we have to tie it to a particular port so that applications which are running outside of this server can communicate with this program. So let's say the program is running on port number 6000 and the IP address of the EC2 instance for that matter is 20.10.101, and as the program is running on port number 6000, the endpoint URL would be 20.10.101 followed by colon 6000 because that's where the program is running. And let's say we have something called get price. Now how the implementation of this would be done, I'll show you that in the future slides. But let's say there's a programming logic which is tied to this get price. You might have guessed that if it is a programming logic and we want to tie it to a particular word, it might be a function. So let's say get price is a function, and what it does is whenever we execute this particular piece of code, the program connects to the database and get the data. That's what it does. That's what it is, functionality. Now I want to expose this particular functionality to the outside world so that the client applications can use this functionality to retrieve records from the database. That's what the purpose is. Now, if we run the Python program within the server, there should not be any problem because we just execute the program. The Python program would connect to the database and get the data. If it is inside of a function named get price also, that is also fine, no problem. But what happens is that we want other programs to use the functionality of this particular program to get the data from the database. And we want to do this because we do not want other client applications to connect to the database directly. And that can be done only by this particular server application. Let's say that is the use case. Now the client application has to connect to the server application using the get price endpoint. Now how it would do? This is the endpoint 20.10.101:6000 because this is where my Python program is running, and followed by it I'll also mention the get price in the client application. So client application would be sending the request to this particular endpoint, which is 20.10.1:6000 / get price. Obviously it has to be appended by HTTP. And this is the endpoint that the client would call. And this is the resource URL, which is nothing but the API. And this API has been exposed by the server application. Now, why do I say so? Because if you see the way we are addressing, the way we are using the API is basically the IP address of the server where the program is running and its corresponding port, followed by the name get price. Now, if we use this endpoint or URL from the client application, what would happen is that the client application will hit the port, which is 6000, and then it will go to the program as the program is running, and then it will go to get price function maybe, and then the data would be retrieved from the database and the data would be sent to the client in JSON format. And if there are any data that you want to send to this endpoint URL, you have to send it in JSON also. So we are essentially using REST API. And let's say we have a DNS name for this particular endpoint, for this particular server. We can use that DNS name also, something like this: http://retailapp.com/getprice. Now this retailapp.com is pointing to 20.10.101:6000. Now, if the client application uses this endpoint, the same thing would happen. It will go ahead and hit the port 6000 and land on the program and on the function get price. And the function would execute its functionality to get the data from the database. Once the data is received, it would be sent back to the client application in JSON format. So this is what REST API does, and this is how the communication happens. In the previous diagram, I had shown you the get price, right? So the get price is there in the Python application. I told you that it might be a function also because it will be executing a logic in the program or a certain business logic which is implemented in the program. So now let's take a look at how the API implementation is done in Python. So actually it is done using functions or methods in Python. If you are running plain and simple Python program, then it will be functions. If you are using classes, then it will be methods. So the functions in classes are also known as methods, as you already know. So let's say this is the function define, calculate final price, and then there is certain logic, and this function is returning order ID and total price in JSON format. And this is the endpoint URL, which is server IP URL followed by get price. Now let's say this get price is tied to this function whose name is calculate final price. Now what would happen is that whenever we execute this endpoint from a client machine or a client application, this piece of code would be executed and the data would be generated in JSON format. And then the data would be sent back to the client application. There can be one confusion here in this particular slide, that how the get price API or the entire API URL or the endpoint URL is tied or mapped to this particular function. Actually, I have not shown you yet. And that's where I introduce you to Flask. So what is Flask? It's a framework to build web applications, web services, also known as APIs. You already know what web applications and web services are. And Flask is used to build both web applications and web services. To install Flask, this is what we do: pip3 install Flask, or it can be pip install Flask also. And inside of the Python program, if you want to use the Flask module or the Flask library, we'll have to import it like this: from Flask import the Flask class. And you already know what import is. Flask is the module or the library, and capital Flask Flask is the class that is there in the library. So now what will I do is I will create a completely new project, and then I will install Flask there, and we'll see what libraries and classes are there in the Flask module. Let's go ahead and do that.